All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. We're just getting started a couple of minutes late just for those who we know the elevators down to one. So making sure those could just kind of trickle on in. So again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Liv Humphrey. I am with Partners in Scott County Watershed, and we are at our 2024 Spring Conservation Quarterly, our first one of the year. So that's really, really exciting. Today we have a special guest coming from Prairie Rivers Network. I'm really excited to have her here talking about what she gets to talk about, which is the Quad City Climate Assessment. If you guys haven't heard about it, seen about it, I'm glad that you're here today. We'll get some more faces in front of it. So just some housekeeping, because that's my favorite. Maybe. Oh, we just have to click today. All right, so this is our board made up of all the wonderful community members that help make partners who they are. So I always like to plug them in and give them a lot of love and thanks, because again, I would not have to do what I do without them. So these are for those who are on Zoom. We just have a little bit of Zoom housekeeping. This presentation is recorded. So those in the audience that have questions, keep that in mind. Those who are on Zoom, keep that in mind. If you do have a question, please ask at the end of the presentation. We'll have a little chat. I'll be moderating it as it goes. So again, just enter the questions in the chat box. I have it kind of circled to have an idea of what that looks like. And then just change the recipient to Liv Humphrey, that's me, so I can physically see it. Or if you want all of those in Zoom to look at it, that's fine too. So save the date, we're in the new year, which is super exciting. We have a Earth Month kickoff cleanup, which is April 6th. I have the details in that QR code if you want to scan now. If not, I have a lot of information about partners and how to find information about what we do in the back. With some more QR codes and all that good stuff. If you have trouble scanning a QR code, let me know. I can help out. We can always pull this slide back up later. And then we also have our spring snapshot coming in May 7th. And then a little bit after that will be the next conservation quarterly as well. So mark those in your calendar. We'd be excited to have everybody there. Share it with your friends, your organizations, your families, whoever. And yeah, we're excited. And, can everyone hear me okay in the back? Okay, cool. I can project louder, but I'll try not to. All right, we always like to plug in to become a member of Partners in Scott County Watershed. We have wonderful members that, again, help participate, volunteer, donate. They do a lot of really, really great things. So I also have a QR code again, more information in the back. And those are just some member costs. And then a big thank you to all of our sponsors and those who help partners. And all right, so we have Nina Struss coming on up to talk about the Quad City Climate Assessment. I'll switch our PowerPoints over, so just give me a brief second, and then we'll let her do her thing. Okay, bear with me. Did it? Okay. Yeah, perfect. Good.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here today to hear me speak a little bit more about the Quad Cities Climate Assessment. This is going to hopefully be released finally by the end of this month. We are in the very, very, very final editing stages, making sure that it looks good and pretty and ready to present. But I'm excited to be able to share some of the findings with you all today.
How do I know?
Yeah.
There, okay. So as Liv mentioned, my name is Nina Struss. I am with Prairie Rivers Network. I am the River Health and Resiliency Organizer. I've been with Prairie Rivers now since July of last year. And if you're not familiar with us, we are based in Champaign and have been doing work in the environmental sector as a nonprofit for over 50 years throughout the state of And our crew kind of spans many different assets of work as it pertains to, you know, renewable energy, as well as clean water, healthy soils, healthy land. And my is brand new here to the Quad City, starting in July. And so we're probably going to be expanding that work a little bit further out into the watershed too, right? So we have a lot of work that we'll be kind of looking at in the Iowa side and even further as we get further into this climate assessment as well. A little bit of background on myself too. I am brand new actually to this sector. So my background is actually in nutrition. I worked for the past 15 years as a dietitian, which I still am technically, and really kind of does still connect to the environmental sector too. This is still kind of new language for me. I would give that as a little precursor just because I am still getting to learn all of the different acronyms and et cetera that comes with it. So.
But I mean, from last year, from, what's in there.
Sorry, making sure we get muted because there was.
This year, we had the 10.
Okay. So in the summer of 2023, the National Wildlife Federation initiated a climate and vulnerability assessment here in the Quad Cities to serve as a resource and tool to advance future conversations around natural infrastructure and resilience. And so what the purpose of this is, this project is to equip local leaders, decision makers, and community members in the Quad Cities with locally relevant information in terms of how it's going to be impacted with climate change, empower those community members to identify and pursue those greater investments and long-term resilience opportunities and projects where appropriate, and then serve as a foundation for stakeholders to make those informed choices to leverage funding opportunities here within the region. I will say this multiple times, but I always like to be very transparent that this is not a prescriptive plan. When this document is released, it will not be, this is what Rock Island needs to do, Davenport, et cetera, in order to achieve these outcomes. Instead, it's just really a guide for the communities to be able to utilize to look at more nature-based solutions to help with the resilience of the community. So again, that product will be a community-driven climate assessment for the Quad Cities region with input from those relevant stakeholders. And again, I don't know why this didn't change, but it's not mid-February. Hopefully by the end of this month of March of 2024, we will have that released and ready to go. This assessment is modeled after another assessment that was done by the National Wildlife Federation in the Texas Mid-Coast region, just as kind of an FYI if you're curious a little bit more about that work. So this project was made possible through a multidisciplinary team, the National Wildlife Federation, which brings decades of expertise working on conservation issues across the Mississippi River, as well as in Illinois. Prairie Rivers Network, we are the state affiliate of the National Wildlife Federation, but also skilled in the facilitation, coordination, and bringing together those different stakeholders here within the Quad Cities, and supporting and advocating for solutions outside of that political landscape. And then the University of Illinois Discovery Partners Institute brings the scientific knowledge and experience of conducting climate assessments in other parts of Illinois. The following graphic shows the essential components that comprise the current Quad Cities assessment. And so I will touch on a few key pieces of each one of these sections as we go throughout this presentation today.
Yeah, the camera's not.
So why the Quad Cities? If you're unfamiliar, I feel like most of us here are familiar with the Quad Cities and know the 5 cities. We have Bettendorf, Davenport on the Iowa side, Rock Island, East Moline and Moline on the Illinois side, but know that we, are river towns, and with home to many residents and numerous businesses throughout the Quad Cities, we rely on the Mississippi River as a vital resource for things like manufacturing and commerce, transportation, and then also providing those outdoor and recreational benefits to our community members as well. We also know that our proximity to the Mississippi River and the Rock Rivers also increase our risk for flooding as well, which impacts all of those components that I just discussed.
I don't want to be
The Quad
rude.
Cities region also has,
Can I say something really quick?
yes.
The screen, like the Zoom screen that we're seeing, I don't think is matching the screen that you're talking with on the teleprompter. Like all we see is just like a side screen for Canvas, and then we're on like the 6th slide or one of the 7th slide. We're just stuck on it.
They're saying they're just stuck on the 7th slide.
Yeah, the conservation quarterly Quad City climate assessment, March 19th, the 7th slide. That's all we see. At least that's what I see.
Okay.
I've been muting people and.
No, that's okay.
Now I think I see now I think it's good. Now we see a case for the Quad Cities.
Okay. My apologies.
No,
You
that's
didn't
okay.
miss too much in terms of like visuals of the screens. I've just been muting people, so because I thought so. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. My apologies.
There we go.
And then let me switch here. Hide presenter view.
Okay.
Good. All right. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. Okay. So in addition, the Quad Cities also has many natural features. We have wetlands, floodplains, forests, rivers, creeks, and open green spaces, which we know provide some of those protective benefits, can help with slowing runoff, increasing floodplain water storage capacity, enhancing surface water infiltration to improve water quality, and reducing the urban heat island effect as well, while also sequestering carbon dioxide. This figure here showcases the broad land cover in our region, which includes a combination of croplands, grasslands, forests, along with emergent wetlands surrounding those water bodies. So in addition to that hazard risk reduction benefits, several studies have highlighted the importance of natural features in fostering, a sense of community, promoting ecosystem biodiversity, offering opportunities for recreation, and connecting people to nature. And so we see that in the studies, and that was echoed also in our stakeholder outreach. When asked, what do you value within the Quad Cities as it pertains to natural features? Why do you think that they are important? Those themes came up very frequently, that connection to nature being extremely important. We also see the broader landscape as it pertains to the wider watershed perspective. And again, in conversations with those local Quad City stakeholders, one conversation that we had that came up numerous times was the necessity for looking upstream and downstream. So within that wider watershed, to kind of help see how upstream helps impact the downstream effects that we see here within the Quad Cities. So human activities, particularly greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion and deforestation, drive that global climate change. Both Illinois and Iowa are already experiencing the effects of climate change, including more frequent heat waves. We're seeing milder winters. This is a really great example this year, unfortunately, of a pretty mild winter, and changing patterns of precipitation as well. So as climate change progresses and we see those global temperatures continue to rise, these impacts are expected to increase over time. And so as part of this assessment, we wanted to see, I don't know. Oh, I have a different one. I'm going to fast forward through those slides, sorry. So as part of this assessment, we wanted to better understand how the local impacts here in the Quad Cities are going to be, what local stakeholders had viewed as those climate risks, and then take those climate risks and see how they were going to be impacting the Quad Cities towards the end of the century. And so that started with stakeholder interviews with several different people and organizations around the area. And then from there, we also made sure to engage the public as possible through a couple of different public input sessions. And we're able to, again, offer that space for questions, concerns, to really make sure that this assessment was shaped using community using the community input as much as possible. And so what we found to be the biggest climate risks here in the Quad Cities was, of course, flooding. Both river flooding as well as flash flooding was one of the top concerns, followed by extreme weather, specifically the extreme heat. And then, of course, too, there was also others that were brought up. Drought was brought up, the extreme weather. You know, we had many instances of tornadoes in areas that we hadn't before, the derecho, which was further in the past, but then even wildfire came up as well as being of a concern through the Quad Cities. And so when we look at specifically flooding and predicting the future flooding here in the Quad Cities, it does involve a wide range of factors. So we have the global climate change that we're working with, but also local weather patterns, precipitation changes, and then how we utilize and choose to build upon the land. And because the Quad Cities is situated along the Mississippi River, we are susceptible to both that river flooding as well as flash flooding, and future risks will depend on several key elements. Climate change is a significant driver, potentially leading to increased rainfall intensity, more frequent extreme weather events that heighten that flood risk. And then, of course, the local topography, existing flood control infrastructure, land use decisions, and urban development is also going to shape that future flood risk. Dynamic factors like topography, soil type, land use, and local water management system capacity should also be considered in flood risk assessments. So while the rainfall is a common factor associated with flooding, it doesn't mean that flooding is going to occur everywhere it rains, right? So rainwater may run off and impact areas downstream, for example. So the relationship between rainfall and flooding is influenced by a combination of those natural and human-made factors. Over the next 3 slides, I'm going to show you some mapping that one of our partners, so the Discovery Partners Institute, has done to take a look at what the future projections could look like for flood risk here in the Quad Cities. So I have early, mid-century, and end-of-century projections. I'm going to bring back those slides also later in the presentation to show you how the possibility of adding in nature-based solutions can reduce that potential climate risk. So I will toggle back between those slides too, so you can kind of see some of the difference in between them. And so this first one here takes a look at early century. So the years 2030 to 2050. And I'm going to start because I feel like we look at those years, especially for myself, as I was looking through this data, and you look through those years and you think that's far off, right? That's not something I have to worry about. And especially as we move further into the end of the century. And so just to kind of put it into perspective, I have a 6-year-old, and if hopefully he will live by the end of the century that we're talking about here, and if he does by the end of the century, he will hopefully be around 83 years old. And so it may not be our lifetime through this end of century that we see these risks, but our children will. And we all either have children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, kids in our neighborhood, kids that we know that will be the ones that will be really experiencing these effects. So just to kind of put that in perspective. Now, when you look at the flood model simulations that I have here from this assessment, it's going to reveal that, of course, areas close to the Mississippi River are going to become even more prone to river floods due to that increased rainfall and higher stream flows, especially in downstream regions like Rock Island. And when you're looking at this map too, so we have the legend here, yellow is anywhere between 0 to 1 foot of water. And so one thing I want you to kind of see as I move through these next couple of slides is that the yellow will increase in areas. And then also too, the depth will start to increase. So you will start to see some areas that are in yellow start to hit those blues as well. So this is again that early century. Here we move into mid-century. And I will toggle back just so you can kind of see. So you can see here, there is more extensive flooding as it pertains to just that 0 to 1 foot, as well as there being more of that darker blue, so that higher extent of flooding too. The other thing to note too, I don't know if you guys can kind of see it on here as well, but we've got, you know, these are our bridges, 74 here, Centennial, and so that most likely there's yellow on all of these as you toggle back and forth is standing water. But again, anywhere between 0 to 1 foot of water, standing water on a bridge could be an issue. So again, this is early century, mid-century, just so you can kind of see some of the differences. You can also see on towards the right here, some significant depths and flooding that occur. And then here's end of century. So again, more extensive, more instances of that yellow, and then also seeing some other instances of where there was blue becoming even darker in blue.
So where the blue's behind the yellow, is that like where streams are coming in? In the community?
Where are you referencing?
Well, like behind Davenport.
I think it's Black Hawk Creek, just means it probably makes sense, go farther up and.
Okay.
Yeah, because I don't. It's a good question. Yeah.
And is the 45 feet, is that like standing water or is that greater flooding than? It's like, you know, the yellow is 45 more feet than normal.
Do you mean like from the flooding that would already be occurring?
Right.
Or
is this like just?
This is
45
just
feet
like-
standing?
just like the standing water would be depth. I will verify that though too, because as I mentioned, these graphs were created using one of our partners, and they are very skilled at kind of like the logistical components of these maps. But yeah, this is, from what I understand through the conversations I've had with them, this is where standing water would be, and then the depths where that would be.
My question would be like, yeah, I think maybe it's just similar to what she was asking, I'm not totally sure. But like where the yellow is, and then like along the river, and then further inland, there's like blue color.
Yeah,
Why would there be deeper water?
What?
more-
inland, yeah, so, okay, so why would we be seeing, I'm just repeating the question if they can't hear me on Zoom, so, why would there be more blue coloring the further inland that you get versus there being, versus yellow? That's a really good question, and again, it all depends on how the flooding is occurring, whether it is directly coming from the river, whether it's coming downstream, so it's occurring from runoff, or also too, whether it is part of the water management system. So are we seeing the flooding coming up from, the sewers? Is it a matter of that water not having a place to go from all of those different factors combined?
And would this be like all the time, or is this just when there is flooding occurring, like during the spring flooding season?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's a really great question, and I will get confirmation on that, but it is my assumption that it is during the river flooding season.
So that little river's the Rock River.
Yeah, the Rock River is down over here on the right side.
So it's like it combines with Mississippi Overland.
Yeah, so you do get a picture a little bit here of the Mississippi as well as having the rock here on the side. The primary focus for this assessment was on the Mississippi River, but we are then, and I'll talk a little bit further about this as we get further along. Some of the next steps in this assessment is going to be looking further out into the watershed and incorporating some of that, more of the Rock River as well as it pertains to natural infrastructure and the flooding. All right, I'm going to keep going forward. So in addition to the flooding as well, detailed explanations about precipitation patterns and instances of extreme precipitation. So that would be where we see that precipitation surpassing the critical threshold of 3 inches per hour are provided in the modeling of the assessment, and we have it for each city as well, so it's broken down. Here specifically on this graph where you see the number of alarming events through, I'm sorry, you guys are seeing, I'm gonna hide this. I'm sorry. The number of alarming flood events for each decade here. So East Moline, anytime you see just East Moline by itself, it does include Moline's data as well. So East Moline and Moline are included together just as kind of an FYI there. And so here you'll see Bettendorf and Davenport are expected to have more rainfall. However, the flooding from heavy rainfall will result in more flood events downstream. So especially looking at Rock Island kind of being one of those vulnerable cities because of it being downstream. Yes.
How is it predicted that Bettendorf and Davenport are expected to have more rainfall?
That's a great question. I will have to get back to you on that.
That's interesting that it's made as a statement because it could be the geography, I suppose. Because I live up top of the bluff myself. But it's interesting they make that statement without saying why. Why it's predicted Bettendorf, Davenport, not Rock Island and East Moline. We're miles apart from each other.
And there might be some more of that information in detail in the assessment. And I appreciate you guys as my audience today, because this is probably my 3rd presentation that I've done with this assessment. And so part of this too is collecting the feedback and the questions and taking it back to my team and being able to provide that follow-up and those answers too. My guess is, and I can look it over here just when we're done too in this section to see, yeah. And a lot of this data is coming from that more technical side. So there's a lot of that language and technicality in the report that DPI has done for this as well. And so, but I appreciate you asking that question because those are probably things that I need to have in my own notes because as I've done, it's been kind of more of a broader audience. And so having a little bit more of that expertise in the room today is kind of good to know as well. Yeah. So no, I appreciate that. Yeah, I think, but along your lines, it is probably dependent on, the location and just kind of where those weather events are predicted to come from. But I can also follow up as well, especially to be able to send out the slides too. So.
Sorry, really quickly.
Yeah.
I also was wondering what an alarming flood event might be, like, would that be like a major flood stage or cross into like a record breaking?
Yeah, that's a good question too.
Could you repeat that question?
Yes, the question was, what defines an alarming flood event?
I believe that would be the surpassing critical threshold of 3 inches per hour.
Well, that was the extreme precipitation. That's what we categorize the extreme precipitation as, which would be 3 inches per hour. But I believe that's in the data too, so I need to go back and look at that.
That'd be above a floodplain?
Yeah, it's probably above a certain threshold, and I feel like I have that in the data too. So these are some questions that I can answer probably right after this presentation. Any more? I appreciate the questions and the feedback too. Okay. Okay. So then also heat being one of those risks, those climate risks that were identified, we will see both extreme heat and cold can negatively impact the social and natural systems. And those extremely hot days are one of the leading cause of weather-related fatalities in the United States, contributing to both poor public health and economic stress. So as climate change continues, the Quad Cities are expected to see more hot days. So when the temperature increases above 95 degrees, and extremely hot days when the temperature increases above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And the number of hot days will increase from 3 days at present to anywhere between 28 to 58 days based on the rate of global greenhouse gas emissions. And I didn't say this previously before looking at those maps, those flooding maps, but I think it is important to mention that the data that we have is not static. It does those outcomes definitely do depend on how global greenhouse gas emissions go. And so we do have the scaling in the assessment. There are different levels that are scaled based off of where we could potentially sit for those emissions. The Quad City area is vulnerable to other extreme events. We kind of talked about derechos, tornadoes, and drought as well. And so while not all are explicitly tied to climate change, changes in temperature and precipitation will impact the frequency and severity of some of those. So for instance, those rising temperatures contribute to longer, more severe wildfire seasons and increased drought risk. Drought conditions create ideal conditions for wildfires. And so dry trees and vegetation, they serve as that fuel, while low soil and air moisture facilitate the rapid spread. And so the cities within the Quad Cities have varying wildfire risk. According to the USDA's wildfire risk to communities tool, as you can see here, in general, we have a medium risk for Rock Island and Davenport, and a lower risk for Moline and East Moline and Bettendorf. But it is something also to just keep in mind as we think about that broader scale too. I know through conversations with stakeholders, there was quite a few programs and organizations that were affected by the wildfires this past summer. And so something that isn't directly here can still affect us here as we move forward also. And so what does this mean? What are we looking at in terms of what is actually at risk? As we experience climate change here in the Quad Cities, we are going to have key assets and resources that are going to be at risk. So ecosystems like forests and wetlands and rivers that provide that temperature regulation, water storage and drinking water benefits may be negatively impacted, and their ability to provide such vital services may be impaired. The intensity and frequency of flooding and drought are projected to increase, and floodwaters and increased precipitation can aid in the loss of soil and essential microorganisms from that soil erosion. And these microorganisms help to protect and break down excess nutrients and pesticides, which in turn helps to improve our water quality. With increased flooding, there's a risk for more pollutants across the landscape that ultimately degrade drinking water quality. For example, we have agricultural runoff containing sediment, excessive nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, pesticides and chemicals from agricultural and industrial sources that already threatens our river resources as well. So really looking at those impacts, in terms of agriculture too, agricultural yields may be impacted by those rising temperatures, increased rainfall, flood risks, and drought. And then that the heat and water stress may reduce corn yields by mid-century, with declining soybean yields to follow. Climate change can also threaten the region's economic viability and public health. Critical infrastructure that connects the region, like our I-74 bridge, may be more prone to flooding. Significant health risks like stroke and heat exhaustion are likely to increase with more days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You can also see here some businesses that could be potentially impacted, which we saw on the original graphs that I had showed previously, or maps that I had showed previously. Also considering, work-related disruptions, if it's, too dangerous to be outside, whether it's from wildfire smoke, the heat, or we're impacted in other ways as well. Also important to note, not all communities will equally experience climate change impacts. Communities within the floodplain tend to be more susceptible to flood risk. Older adults, lower socioeconomic groups, people with disabilities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, those BIPOC communities, unhoused communities, immigrant and refugee populations, and renters are also groups that have been identified at facing higher risks than others. Yes,
Do you know if the Iowa and Illinois DOT were involved in the conversations?
I believe so. Yes, we tried to, I know that some of those connections and conversations were done through other members of our team.
Very good, thank you.
Mhm. I can make sure on that though. Iowa DOT, and Illinois DOT, is that what you said? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Mhm. Yep. So while I've showed some of these slides that seem, kind of frustrating, sad, right? This report is really not intended to be all doom and gloom. We really want it to be something that helps inspire community-wide understanding and support in terms of the importance of resilience planning, as well as the importance of looking at more nature-based solutions throughout the whole scope of planning. And again, I already mentioned it, but these findings are not static and are projected based on the path that we are on right now. But we have the power to change that trajectory by changing the way we develop in the future in a way that is more in sync with our natural features and make investments to protect and strengthen these features also. And also too, climate change is an interdisciplinary problem and requires interdisciplinary solutions. And so resilience planning not only involves the urban landscapes, but of the Quad Cities, but also looking outward in the watershed to increase the resilience of the Quad Cities landscape and the communities that are affected. If you're not familiar, nature-based solutions, which are designed to conserve, restore ecosystems or mimic natural systems, and are typically cost-effective solutions for mitigating those natural hazards that provide social, economic, and environmental benefits. It is important to note, though, that implementation must consider scale, location, and community needs and desires. Oftentimes you'll hear the terms interchanged with green infrastructure or natural infrastructure being included in those nature-based solutions also. When we say nature-based solutions, we mean the actual conservation and restoration of natural features like wetlands and forests, floodplains, stream banks, but the term also applies to the way that we develop as well. So for instance, looking at flood buyouts in areas that are considered the floodplain and relocating and utilizing that area that's left in place to be a nature-based solution. These are some examples of nature-based solutions. We do have some of the more, broader, larger scale nature-based solutions that are here too, but I always like to mention that even some of the smaller scale ones can be beneficial. Implementing a rain garden or ways to be able to conserve water within your home can be considered also a nature-based solution. They're dynamic really too, and the able to adapt and even grow stronger with time. Approaches to conservation and the way we develop are also considered nature-based solutions. So developing in a way that considers not only the centrally affected communities or areas, but also communities and areas downstream would be considered a nature-based approach too. One of the reasons we heard so much feedback about looking upstream in this process too. So I think I mentioned this already, but our assessment tried to provide some recommendations and site-specific analysis to quantify nature-based solutions for the Quad Cities. But there are other larger scale practices that can have the benefits for flood reduction and overall improvement to things like soil health, especially as it pertains to that broader watershed approach and climate risk reduction. Also, to just a quick note that it is important to consider equity as we talk about these implementing nature-based solutions. Historically, the communities that are typically most affected have not always been brought to the table. And so it's important to make sure that those communities that are being directly affected by these climate risks are included from the beginning in the planning stages, design, execution, and maintenance of these projects. If not implemented with that careful care, there is the opportunity to see those negative consequences, even though we're trying to utilize a positive approach. And so just keeping that in mind, there's a really great document out now. It's called the Mississippi River Equity Vision, which is a great Quad Cities crafted document that really seeks that alignment with stakeholders for a clean and sustainable Mississippi River that focuses on the lived experiences of the underrepresented and historically marginalized community members. So it's one area that we kind of point people to of like, well, tell me exactly what I can do, right? Like, tell me some things that I can exactly, do in these different areas. And it really has a great outline of some of those opportunities that are available. I'm not going to spend too much time on these next two slides. You'll have the opportunity to have this PowerPoint slide, but just to kind of we have an example from Boston that takes a look at the importance of why we want to make sure that we are including those marginalized communities in the discussions around nature-based solutions. And I can also send out the full study that takes a look at the negative and positive consequences in terms of green infrastructure. For the sake of time today, I am going to go. So there's a Boston example, and then there's also an example here from Rhode Island that takes a look at more of that positive side of utilizing everybody within the conversation surrounding the natural infrastructure, making sure that inclusion starts from the beginning of those conversations and is gone all the way through that implementation and maintenance phase to make sure that those communities that are already affected aren't further negatively affected. These next couple of slides, I am going to show before and afters of the early, mid, and end of century. So with this assessment, we analyzed the effectiveness of a few types of nature-based approaches by overlaying the flood risks with site-specific solutions. So things like vegetative swales, permeable pavements, and green roofs being a couple of the different options, mainly ways to help manage the water flow. And across each of the Quad Cities communities, the performance of these nature-based solutions were evaluated based on the predicted reduction in peak runoff and improvement in the infiltration capacity as compared to the baseline absence of nature-based solutions. And so on the top here, you can see that is the previous slide I showed a little bit ago with the flood inundation for early century. And the bottom here is with the implementation of some of those nature-based solution practices that I just mentioned. So seeing flood reduction benefits in the peak flow discharge, so less areas that have yellow and also fewer areas that have that dark blue occurring. Here we have mid-century, taking a look at the benefits. Again, the top was the slide that I showed previously, and the bottom showing the opportunity available after nature-based solutions. And of course, too, we say this in the assessment, but it is important to note that further modeling is required to understand just how well specific nature-based solutions would work based on the location and scale. And also to noting that these are just a few that we looked at to be able to show the benefits. There are obviously, as I showed on the other slide, other different ways for utilizing those nature-based solutions, especially as you move further out in the watershed approach too. Yeah, Dawn.
And then how many, like, how do you know, what are those based on? Like,
Yeah.
How many,
Do you need to put
practices?
in?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. You asked me that question
know.
before.
And I still wanna know.
I know, no, it's on my list of questions. Yeah, and I think part of that too just kind of falls into the scale of, do we provide a specific number? Because then does that hinder the actual progress of how the Quad Cities chooses to utilize this data
But in
and
general, they
develop?
had to have some kind
Yeah,
of baseline,
mhm.
right, that they're using.
I would assume so. I'll, as soon as I get done today, I'll send an email to, Abhinav. And also too, you will have the contact information for the other two that have kind of been key in the development of this assessment. But if you have some more specific technical questions, are open to answering those as well. I'll get that to you for sure, Dawn. Appreciate bringing that back up. As well. And also, so the alarming flood events, as I had mentioned before, we had seen the increasing events previously, and then also here seeing the numbers change for some of the cities as well, based off of that nature-based solution implementation. And I'm still gonna, I've got the questions in my mind of what qualifies the alarming flood events. Throughout the climate assessment, as I've mentioned, Quad City stakeholders were engaged to understand the regional needs and opportunities and then provide feedback on the preliminary findings from the assessment. Through these input sessions that we had, there were 3 tiers that came up pretty repeatedly in terms of providing those top priorities for advancing regional resilience. So we have education, research, and funding. And moving from the planning to the implementation stage was the most common gap that was identified by the stakeholders. And so again, this is not a prescriptive plan, but this is really a great way to see where we have from a baseline standpoint of that knowledge in terms of what we need to get to a higher level as it pertains to the resilience planning here in the Quad Cities. So ultimately, lots of education came up very, very frequently, all the way from the youth to adults and different groups, understanding what's at risk and how we can help to reduce those risks, continuing with the research, making sure that science is a critical component, and then funding, really making sure that we have the funding to be able to support those potential projects and maintenance of those projects, and staff to also support them as well. This is a really nice resource that is available through the National Wildlife Federation, the key considerations for effective resilience planning. And they can include things like recognizing natural systems as critical infrastructure, considering equity implications of nature-based solutions, and integrating nature-based solutions into existing planning processes. And so these 7 key principles developed by the National Wildlife Federation are to be considered for those nature-based solution implementation at the local level. And these are available on their website as well. And I can easily send that out to you all if needed. So wanted to just include a few key things that had come up as potential projects or ways to increase that nature-based solution that came up in some of our conversations with stakeholders through some of these meetings. Increasing green space came up very frequently, utilizing areas that have not been used or are recently vacant. A great example would be where the old YMCA used to be. Just not too far from here, utilizing that space as a potential green space, but including more tree cover to help with that urban heat island effects as well, improving our tree equity scores also, and potentially even increasing our flood risk or decreasing our flood risk. Ravine restoration came up as well, specifically looking in Rock Island, Moline, and East Moline as a way to conserve some of that excess stormwater runoff, but also connecting and improving biodiversity. And then looking at how to provide equitable access to the river as well. I know we have some great grant funding that is going through to help with that right now. Looking at different areas that might be affected, communities that might be affected. Is the access to the river actually equitable, not only from the standpoint of it being accessible to be able to walk there, but is it accessible for other individuals as well who might need other assistance? So some great conversations that had come up within those conversations. And then also, what were some of the next potential steps that community members really wanted to see once this assessment came out? And so again, utilizing this report as a way to apply for funding so we can get more of those solutions here in the Quad Cities. Communicating with policy members came up very frequently, people who are in power or positions of power, utilizing it as a way to have those conversations and decision makers and talk about the urgency of even just incorporating more of these aspects in that planning. Advocacy, again, for a more equitable vision for the river and for resilience to these climate risks. And then also too, looking at the workforce. Do we have a workforce that could actually take on projects like these? So that came up in several conversations of, okay, well, if we have these projects, do we have contractors that can actually, do these projects, provide that planning, assistance, and also the implementation and maintenance of it too? What does that look like here for the Quad Cities? Education that's focused on the importance of looking at nature-based solutions. What do they do? How do we implement them? How do we help maintain them? How do we help that support? And looking at not just in the communities, but media outlets as well. And then finally, looking upstream. Are we looking upstream to rural and agricultural communities and those impacts in not only their community, but then how it might impact the communities that are further downstream? So what does that mean as we look towards those next steps here in the Quad Cities? So full assessment should hopefully be released, as I mentioned, by the end of this month. And ideally, we will be utilizing that assessment to leverage, advancing climate resilience here in the Quad Cities. So it will be a lot of meetings, presentations, conversations, as well with people that I've already talked to, as well as engaging other individuals and communities that I haven't had conversations with yet. And looking at how does nature-based solutions, how can that show up further here in the Quad Cities to help combat these climate risks? Helping to contribute to that organized community. One thing that I found through doing a lot of this engagement is that there is so much passion and drive and interest in projects and organizations revolving around the environmental sector here on both sides of the river. And so really, hopefully having this be another unifying piece to help pull that together, because as you all know, how each side of the river manages the river is very differently. It's also very differently politically, right? There's a lot of differences that we have going on, but there's also something special about being a part of the Quad Cities community too, and having that be a unifying aspect. And then sharing opportunities for outreach, assessment, dissemination. Ideally, the next steps of this project would be to start looking and talking with communities about opportunities for projects that we could help support in the way of just, again, bringing together different communities. I wish I could just give money out, right? And say, here, I'll help fund your opportunity. But really starting to help put some support behind some of those nature-based solutions that are going to see effects. And then, as I mentioned, too, really working with the team to kind of take a look further up into the watershed as well and expand into that rural and agricultural sectors too. I just threw a lot of information at you guys, and I know some of you have already asked some questions, and I appreciate the grace provided to me as I am able to kind of start taking some of those down. My information is here. I also have my card in the back, some information on Prairie Rivers Network. I also have the ability, you can sign up for updates from us. And for those online, you can go to our website and click on get updates, I think is what it is. It's a great way to know, stay up to date on events that I'll be doing, presentations, anything surrounding the assessment. When the assessment is released, you'll get the document in your email account as well. Any kind of action alerts that are pertinent too. But also to Arsum and Abhinav are two of the, are on my team who are just awesome. Arsum was part of the Texas assessment, so this is really in her wheelhouse, and Abhinav is with the Discovery Partners Institute, has more of that technical information. So they are available too, if you all have any sort of specific questions too. So does anybody have any other questions for me?
I just wonder if that heat island effect with the Davenport across season, because like when you look downtown here, there's virtually no trees, a lot of concrete buildings, that type of stuff.
Is that-
In our newer developments, you know, a lot of those, they just strip the topsoil and.
Yeah, that was identified as being some of the more vulnerable areas here in the Quad Cities as having that higher heat island, a lower tree equity score and a higher heat island effect because of the lack of tree cover here and the way that it's been developed. There is some funding available for interested organizations. If you are interested, let me know, but there is some funding available, especially for tree plantings within communities that are identified to be in that lower tree equity score too. Yeah.
I'm also curious, the tree equity score, is that something Prairie Network came up with, or where's that coming?
No, there is, it is a resource that is available online. I can send that link out. I don't know if you just Google it, if it would come up or not. Let me see, I might be able to get you all a direct, I mean, I know I have it on here.
I know Davenport has like a specific program that you can actually request to have a tree put into a certain part. If you have like a neighborhood where you see a lack of trees, they do it on like edges of sidewalks. There's regulations to it, obviously, and if you have more questions, I'm not the one for that, but I can direct you to that person. But again, there are some things that Davenport is doing to help with it. So you guys can keep those in mind. If you see a place in Davenport that's like, that could be a tree, we have resources.
We talked about green infrastructure, the Illinois EPA just came out with a grant for green infrastructure type practices, so maybe you take a look at those. Also, we were looking at a grant for that river ravine.
Oh, yeah.
The rock river.
Possibility of 319 implementation grant, something to think about. But the due date for that was May 1st, and we just had a meeting with them. And we thought that's a short time frame to get everything done
Sure.
by May 1st, so we may think about it next cycle.
The tree equity is through AmericanForests.org. It's on, I can't access the internet right now. It's not working, but it's part of their tools, research reports and guides. It's pretty neat because you can go onto the website and you can just plug in your zip code, and then it will bring up your area, and you're assigned a number and a color that tells you where you're at in terms of tree cover and whether or not it's considered to be more equitable. And as you can expect, the immediate Quad Cities, like on both sides of the like closest to the river, is very low on both sides of the river. And it's our floodplain, and so it's very developed, and so that's part of it. Yeah.
So I'm interested in some that the city of Milwaukee actually does claim benefit with tree planting for actually flood resiliency. Those trees do actually act as an interceptor and slows delivery of rainfall, and it's one more component of resiliency.
Yeah, and those would be great things to send. I'd love to know more about that and send along, because I think any kind of great programs and models that we can have to take a look at to bring into this conversation to be able to utilize in addition along with the assessment would be a great thing to have as we have conversations with community members and leaders further.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Really quick. So I was wondering if you can kind of go over again with the flooding in the Quad Cities. Can you kind of go over the risk factors again, and then kind of a two-parter, if you don't mind? Could you kind of talk about, because I know you guys said you don't want to be like, Debbie Downers, obviously with this, you want to like, inform people. Should you kind of talk about the importance for like letting the community know so we can kind of enact on those next steps for the future?
So flooding risks in terms of, can you clarify a little bit more about?
Just kind of like go over like those flooding risks again, because obviously, it can affect businesses, it can affect just road closures and other things like that. Like we went over some of like the impacts that would have, but then also kind of a two-parter to like, the value of like letting us know some of these things so that we can kind of think about, next steps to solve some of these issues.
Sure. So the question was whether or not I could go over again some of those flooding risks and the kind of what's at risk and how we would go about, notifying people and kind of mobilizing, it sounds like, the community around these efforts. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so part of that will be coming from when we have this actual report, our kind of outreach a strategy. A big part, so as I mentioned, I wasn't an integral component in the science and the research and such in that background. My connection is more of that communication piece and connection. And so while I think it's important to talk about the risks, right? We mentioned the environmental risks, looking at potential degradation to some of those, the biodiversity, looking at the agricultural effects, which I think would be pretty significant conversations to have here in the Midwest, but definitely here in the Quad Cities. Water quality, something definitely to consider as we have those higher precipitation events that will be occurring. And then also looking at the business economic effects. That was kind of one of the things when I was looking at the maps of really being concerned about seeing some pretty big businesses that the Quad Cities would be pretty keen on not experience significant flooding, especially along the river. And I mean, there's one section of the assessment that where we talk about the end of the century that talks about floodwaters potentially reaching the I-74 bridge. And so whether or not that is just from an increase in depth or if it is from an increase in heavy precipitation and, downstream, all of those different things coming together. But absolutely, there is that risk to transportation. Here in the Quad Cities, we rely heavily on the bridges. And the maps that we saw previously show all of the bridges having some sort of standing water or water impacts to them. And so, and then not only that, but also the health risks that we could potentially see from the flooding, from the high heat, the wildfires especially. And so when it comes to communicating this message, we're still kind of working on that language because I think it's really easy to scare people. And sometimes when you scare people, they sit and they don't mobilize, right? Because it feels like, well, there's nothing more that I can do. You're telling me this is all that can be done, or I can't do anything because I don't own a farm. I don't own land that can implement some of these big spaces. I can't, put in a wetland in my backyard. And so part of that mobilizing and next steps and really addressing those risks is going to be something where we look at it from not only individual scale, but also going further out. So I envision having lots of individual conversations and having conversations through media outlets and et cetera too, in providing ways to support action, whether it is being members of organizations like partners or getting in with certain local groups and communities and being involved and being a volunteer and having that physical imprint in the landscape. Does that answer your question?
Yes, for the most part. I am one of those media people, by the way, so that's why I was asking because I
Yeah.
was trying to because I know one of the focuses we want to talk about is with regards to the flooding. Sorry if you can't hear me that well.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, we're trying to like, obviously we're talking about this. We're talking like a big portion of it is the flooding, and that's why I was interested in just like, like how the flooding will impact us and why we should be kind of talking about it based on what you're saying. Like, we're simply like, for the next steps, big starting point is simply just to talk about it.
Yeah, to start having conversations, absolutely. To learning more about nature-based solutions, how they can be utilized on an individual scale all the way up through larger scale, but then also just being active within this community and learning more about that perspective. Yeah.
Could you talk about some of those nature-based solutions? I know there was the permeable pavement and then going green with the roofs and like things like that. Could you kind of talk about other like nature-based solutions that we can maybe start thinking about and like kind of like individual side and large scale?
Well, those were addressed on one of the previous slides. Yeah.
I'm only asking this too because for like media for sound, like you're looking at like the classroom and for like an interview or like a sound bite, you wouldn't even be, you're like not looking at the camera. So like getting like a separate, kind of direct with what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, would there be any way that you would be able to write these questions down and I can get them to Nina to have her answer more thoroughly? Just because in this setting, it might be a little bit more difficult as we're trying to wrap up.
Would be able to set up like another Zoom or anything because like I would
Yeah,
need.
I could get you guys connected and she would be
Mhm.
absolutely able to do that.
Okay, well, we can do that then.
Hold it the other two. for
Okay,
better.
yeah, she might even get some more people on her team as well. I can get you guys connected. If you want to put your email in the chat, or you can even email me. I can put it in the chat.
I'll write it in the chat right now.
And then I can get you guys connected and we can set up something else. But I appreciate you so much for coming on and asking your questions.
So, maybe, so I do like.
Anything further? Do you want me to wrap it? I'll be here, so if you guys have another question.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I have that tree equity score.
Thank you. I appreciate you trying to help.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much.
Before we go,